Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Spy Museum. I was in CIA, thrown into some operations in the Middle East. I spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East, but not so much on the Arab-speaking areas. And it has always been a mystery to me, getting the names straight, and the place names straight, and the organization straight. I think one of the most interesting things about the films that we've seen, whether it's Zero Dark 30 or any of the others, that one of the things that the analysts had to do in the beginning was determine there was such a thing, that there was an organization. Of course, eventually it was Al-Qaeda, and it declared itself. And in the case of Hezbollah, I think for many of us, it's just sort of, we have a vague understanding. I'm speaking for myself, so you don't have to buy into any of this. Sort of a vague understanding of, oh yeah, they're the folks in Lebanon, and they fought the Israelis and so forth. But I must say, I knew some of their activities as an intelligence officer. I had no idea of the extent of their activities, of the impact of their activities. I think you've made a huge contribution, Matt, in doing this book, Hezbollah, the global footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. You know, we talk about the threat to our country from these non-state actors. This isn't a non-state actor. This is backed and founded by a state, but you will have more to say on that. Matt has truly written the book on Hezbollah. He is a senior fellow, and I will not give you all of the accolades here, but he is a senior fellow and director of Washington Institute's Stein program on counterterrorism and intelligence from 2005 to 2007. He was also Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Treasury Department. He has served as a senior official in those branches of government and was dealing with the agencies coordinated under the ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence. And he played a central role in what was not a unique approach, but it was something we did rather late in the game. And that was to go after some of these organizations and their sponsoring states through the financial channels, to try and pin down, follow the money, as the saying goes. He was the founding director of its terrorism research branch. And as I mentioned, he served in the FBI as an analyst as well. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Yeshiva, master's in law and diplomacy, and a doctorate from Tufts, graduate research fellow at Harvard. He has done a great deal of writing and speaking and research and testifying as an expert witness. And we are absolutely delighted to have him here this evening. I think the combination of Matt and Reuel will be a terrific treat, but also a way to understand a little bit more about Hezbollah. Please help me welcome Matt Levitt.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here. Reuel, it's always a pleasure. I'll let you tell the story of what happened the last time you and I shared a panel. It worked out well in the end, but he was almost arrested. Let's jump right into it, because we got a lot to discuss. I'm not a big fan of intelligence leaks. I was the deputy chief of one of our smaller U.S. intelligence agencies. I was a senior analyst at the FBI. But one of the things that the Washington Post has reported about these various leaks is that we have some critical blind spots. And according to the Washington Post, some of the leaks revealed that many of these involve Lebanon's Hezbollah movement. That may surprise some. It didn't surprise me. It would have when I started the book, certainly not by the end. Hezbollah is many things. It is a political party. It is a social movement. It is a militia. It is also a terrorist group and an international organized criminal organization. The problem is that all the literature that's out there until this book focused on the former. If you wanted to understand Hezbollah as a political movement, which is important, and you need to understand that if you're going to understand Hezbollah, social movement as a militia. But there was nothing out there on its illicit or covert activities. Academics would go and do research interviewing Hezbollah, which is great, and they'll talk to you about their overt activities. But when you ask them about the covert, they deny it. I was invited after I was at the FBI to an unclassified, by invitation only, U.S. government-sponsored conference, co-sponsored by the CIA and State Department's INR, Intelligence and Research Branch, on Lebanon. And one woman from Lebanon got up at this conference and said, I know you Americans and Israelis believe there's some boogeyman out there named Imad Mugniya, but I've never met him. So I did what a real academic does, and I went and I got an interview with Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah himself. And I asked him, Yes, Sayyid, does Mugniya exist? And he told me no. So clearly he doesn't exist, which is kind of like going up to Al Capone and saying, Al, are you a mob boss? And Al says, no, I'm in the trash disposal business. And that's the end of the conversation. Well, of course they don't acknowledge his existence then, but in 2008 when he was assassinated, the man whose existence was denied in life was very much embraced in death. Before we get to that, let's start at the beginning, and it's an opportune time to do that because this month is the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. Hezbollah had already bombed our embassy once. They would bomb the embassy annex again, but this was a key turning point. You might ask yourself the academic question, though it's entirely academic. What would have happened if after the 1979 revolution, when Iran decided to export the revolution, which was always its intent, it set up agencies and departments to do that, what if it had gone to set up mini-me's in Lebanon, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, and just stopped there? Create your own little mini-Irans in this country. They didn't, and they soon tasked Hezbollah with targeting Western interests. In the first instance, Hezbollah's actions targeting Western interests, first in Lebanon, then in Kuwait, in Europe, and elsewhere, were at the behest of Iran. And that continues to be the primary reason this group, so close to Iran, the U.S. intelligence community describes Iran and Hezbollah as being in a strategic partnership with Iran as the primary partner, why Hezbollah does what it does. It has some of its own interests, sometimes to free incarcerated members of the group, but always tied to Iran. One of the things I was able to do for this book, aside from interviewing many people, is beg for documents and get a whole lot of declassified documents. Some of you who have been in the business and have covered this will see some things that you recognize. I know some of you actually worked some of the cases we're going to discuss tonight. Here's a picture of Mugniya's debut, TW-847, supposed to be a short flight from Athens to Rome with onward service to the United States, ended up ping-ponging back and forth between Beirut and Algiers. It wasn't long before the CIA, as you see here, was penning final product, scene setters, entitled, like here, Wild, Wild West Beirut. You were allowed to get away with that type of thing back in the day. Nowadays, the editors would never let you get away with a title like that. First in Beirut, then in Kuwait and elsewhere. Here you have a picture of Mustafa Badruddin, Mugniya's brother-in-law. The two of them sat on the top of a building and watched the Marine barracks bombing occur, the operation that they had planned together. They then fled to Iran. Later, Badruddin and another Hezbollah operative were sent to Kuwait to carry out a series of 7 bombings in 2 hours. He was also involved peripherally with the attempted assassination of the Kuwaiti emir. They just rammed the wrong car in the convoy. He was arrested. He was convicted. They never actually passed the death sentence, certainly didn't kill him, because Hezbollah made it clear there'd be consequences if they did. And he eventually was freed when Iraq invaded Kuwait, made his way to the Iranian embassy, then Iran, and ultimately Lebanon. All these things that happened then circle back to now. Mustafa Badruddin today succeeded Imad Mugniya as the head of the Islamic Jihad organization. He's been indicted by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, the UN tribunal investigating the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. He's one of the 5 people who've been indicted for that crime. He personally and his movement, along with other Iraqi Shia militants from Dawa and Badr, not just the same organizations, in many cases the exact same individuals would partner again 25 years later, targeting coalition forces in Iraq, and there's an entire chapter on that in the book. It didn't take long before they moved from Kuwait to Germany, most particularly with the Hamadi brothers. Muhammad Ali Hamadi was one of the original hijackers of TW-847. Even though he was on a most wanted list, he didn't mind carrying liquid explosives on his person in his baggage to Frankfurt Airport to resupply another Hezbollah operative in Paris who was carrying out a series of what ended up being 15 different bombings over 1985 and 1986. He was arrested because they found the explosives in his luggage. His brother was released, goes home to Lebanon, kidnaps 2 Germans to free his brother. The brother isn't freed. He kidnaps 2 more German-speaking people. Turned out they were Swiss-German. He releases them. He goes back to Germany and gets arrested there. You can't make this stuff up. And there were more plots in Germany and elsewhere in Europe as Hezbollah expanded. Of the chapters in the book that surprised me most, one was on Africa and one was in Southeast Asia. Most people are aware there's a very large Lebanese diaspora in Africa. Most people are not aware of the deep extent of Hezbollah's operational activity, not just fundraising in Africa. And one of those plots, again, from a declassified CIA report, involves an Air Afrique hijacking that, again, was put together for the specific purpose of demanding the freedom of the Hamadi brothers, among others. This was well before 9/11, well before there's really any serious type of airport security. In this case, the operative got his gun and grenade onto the first airplane by putting them in a box of donuts, which nobody bothered to check. And then on the next flight, put them into a gym bag, presumably with smelly socks, or maybe not. And then in the last plane in Africa, he got bored of coming up with creative ways to move weapons onto airplanes and just bribed somebody and brought them right on the plane. Most people are aware of Hezbollah's terrorist operations in South America, the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, the 1994 bombing less than 2 years later of the Amia Jewish Community Center. And there's a huge chapter on these things, including things most people are not aware of. For example, the communications conduit that they used through New York City, the fact that FBI agents would ultimately come down to the tri-border area of South America where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet to investigate Hezbollah's footprint down there. They flew on military air, not public. And the second they got off the airplane, their pagers started going off. They called back to FBI New York and were told, someone just faxed us a picture of you getting off your airplane, which was a polite way for Hezbollah, which is a very serious intelligence organization, to say, we know that you know that we know that you're here. Welcome. But most people don't know that just weeks before the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Hezbollah came this close to blowing up the Israeli embassy in Bangkok, Thailand. And the only reason it failed, it certainly wasn't foiled, was because the suicide bomber driving a van that was filled with a massive homemade explosive, the only case I know of where Hezbollah actually used an Iranian suicide bomber, by the way, got into a fender bender with one of those three-wheel tuk-tuks in downtown Bangkok in rush hour and fled the scene. And they had no idea what they were doing with it. In fact, they just towed this vehicle, which had this very, very, very dangerous and volatile explosive in the back, hopefully over no potholes, and only later discovered that there was a big bomb in the back, and that in fact the body of the driver of the rented van was stuffed into the explosive. He was killed. Led to a massive US, Israeli, Thai, Filipino, Indonesian, Singaporean, I'm probably leaving some out, joint investigation, which revealed 2 different Hezbollah networks in the region, and interestingly, both led by radical Sunnis from Indonesia. One of them, the more interesting, was a guy named Pandu. He was arrested actually by mistake. There was an intelligence operative on the plane with him as he flew from Mindanao in the south of the Philippines to Manila. And the intention was not to arrest him, but to continue running down this intelligence operation. Unfortunately, he had a certain amount of shabu, methamphetamine, on his person, and the counter-narcotics dogs went crazy. He was arrested immediately. He was almost released until someone from the intelligence side of the shop came and said, forget your little shabu issue here. We got something much bigger, and led to this massive investigation revealing a host of Hezbollah plots throughout Southeast Asia. But I want to focus, lest you think that all of this is happening far away, on Hezbollah in North America, and then a little bit about Hezbollah in the here and now. What you have in front of you is a picture of a JR cigarette tobacco outlet in North Carolina, where Hezbollah got it into its head that it could buy cigarettes cheap in North Carolina, as you see on the left, where there's very little tax, drive them across state lines, so now have a federal offense, to Michigan, where there's very, very high tax. They did this also from some Indian reservations in New York State, and then bought some homes, some cars, nothing special, but also sent a significant amount of money back to Lebanon, some of it for Hezbollah. And as a spy museum, I thought it might be interesting for you to see that while Hezbollah is a very serious intelligence organization and sometimes makes some pretty remarkable mistakes, but most of the time, because of the training they get from Iran, operational security, counterintelligence, the type of stuff Al-Qaeda will never have, and the main reason why many people, although I don't really like the phrase, refer to Hezbollah as the A-team because of this more sophisticated intelligence training they get, you should be aware that we're pretty good at our game too. And here are FBI surveillance pictures of some of these Hezbollah guys in Charlotte, North Carolina, loading up vans and Ryder trucks with the cigarettes that they're going to smuggle across state lines. Parenthetically, they kept getting speeding tickets because they felt that time is money and they were going about 100 miles an hour. And so then they decided it must be that it was racial profiling. And so they paid some Caucasian women, and sometimes men and women posing as families. They put bike racks in the back of the van, and they'd send people on different routes through West Virginia, through Kentucky. And they couldn't understand why apparently the US government was now profiling Caucasian blonde women. they were also getting pulled over. It didn't ever occur to them it's because they were going literally 100 miles an hour. Now, it's very rare, despite some good surveillance, that you will actually have photos of the bad guys in their underwear counting their crumpled up money, which is what you have here. The two main Hezbollah people in the Charlotte cell in their underwear counting their crumpled money. This is not a surveillance photo. This was just them taking pictures of themselves and keeping them in their homes. And when FBI raided, we got them, and here you have them as exhibits. I actually, when I left the FBI, I did not work this case in FBI. When I left the FBI, I ultimately testified as an expert in this case. Now, among the many things that were seized were all kinds of communications back and forth. This is primarily before the internet, so there are letters back and forth. And you see them talking about all kinds of things, not just getting briefed about how's the family, but what's the situation on the ground? How's the military doing? What's the political situation? Who's doing well? Who's doing that? And every once in a while, as they're riding back and forth with this military commander in Burj al-Barajneh in the southern suburbs of Beirut, you get little nuggets, as you see here in the bottom, where he says to his friends in Charlotte, as I greeted the virtuous ones, I must damn the evil ones, damn America the criminal, and the arrogant Israel that commits injustice and hostility, and goes on to say some pleasant things about the United States. Now, you might ask yourselves, how did some of these guys get into the United States? It's easier than you think, especially then, pre-9/11. Mohammed Hammoud was the key person in the cell. He and a couple of his cousins came in on a regular flight on their real Lebanese passports to Venezuela, Margarita Island, where their uncle happened to live, and there happens to be within the expatriate Lebanese community a small but significant Hezbollah presence. After 40 days hanging out with their uncle, they said to the uncle, we need to get some false documents to go into the United States. Uncle says, no problem, I can get you some really good stuff, pretty cheap. They say, no, 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 no. We want the worst stuff you can come up with. We want it in crayon. And then when they got on their planes and flew into New York City, and their false documents were immediately seen for what they were, they said, we are so sorry. You see, you may not know, customs agent, but there's this horrible organization in Lebanon called Hezbollah, and they're forcing young, good Shias like ourselves to join them, and we don't want to join them. So the only thing we knew what to do is to come here with the worst documents we could find, so you'd call us on them, and I could tell you my story, and please, I'm claiming political asylum from Hezbollah, say the Hezbollah operatives. And within hours, they were on the streets in New York and on their way to North Carolina, where they already had a relative. But my favorite story is the story of Saeed Harb, who ultimately, by the way, was flipped and testified against all his buddies because he wasn't actually all that religious. He grew up with them. He was one of the few guys who wasn't a family relation. He was involved in more criminal enterprises than anybody else and probably would have gone away for more than any of the actual Hezbollah guys, and was involved in things like underage pornography. And at one point in the interviews, he begs the FBI agents, please just stop talking about the pornography. Like, he even himself was embarrassed by some of his activities. Well, he missed his wife, Fatma Harb, who happened to be Samir Deb's brother. And so he says to Samir, listen, we got to find a way to get your sister, my wife, into the country. And so they approach the debonair Wayne Swearington at the bottom, and they say to him, Wayne, how would you like an all-expense-paid vacation to Cyprus? All you got to do is marry my wife. And so they go to Cyprus, and they bribe a consular officer, and just to make sure it goes well, they also have the meeting, which is held in English and Arabic. Fatma doesn't speak English, Wayne doesn't speak Arabic, but apparently love knows no bounds. And they didn't actually interpret accurately, they just said what had to be said, and they came into the country that way. There was a huge visa fraud component to this, and it shouldn't surprise. Again, a declassified CIA report on the expanding links between alien smuggling and extremist threats to the United States, and right up front in the key findings is concerns that travelers associated with various terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, are tapping into global alien smuggling networks to abet their movements around the world, including to the United States. In fact, I'm going to give you one of the few cases we know of open source. There are only two of actual terrorists who have come to the United States smuggled from Mexico. One was a Somali Shabab. One was one of the most dangerous Hezbollah people ever to set foot in this country. But before we get to him, I just want to show you what our Charlotte Hezbollah guys were doing before they came to this country. Again, no deep cover surveillance in Lebanon here. These were pictures they were holding onto in their homes. And these are pictures they were holding onto in their homes of what they were doing in North Carolina. You might notice these are not small handguns. These are automatic rifles. These are sniper rifles with some pretty significant scopes. Nothing inherently illegal with this. They had permits, whatnot. But we get a little concerned when people who are Hezbollah, and are in this case primarily engaged in cigarette smuggling to raise money for Hezbollah, are also engaging in shooting in the hills with some pretty sophisticated weapons. Later, when Mohammed Hammoud, who's front and center here holding the automatic weapon, when he's in jail, he actually spoke to someone who was a jailhouse sniff, trying to see if he could hire someone to blow up the court where he felt all the evidence was, and in his words, put a bullet in the arrogant prosecutor's head. Ken Bell was the prosecutor, an amazing guy, and he was held accountable for that too. So these types of ideas were percolating in his head. You can imagine one time when I testified before Congress and I put this picture of them in North Carolina next to this picture of them outside the White House, who got people's attention. Maybe they were just tourists, but they are now in jail for other things. Now, Said Harb, who we mentioned earlier, is here at the top, and he had multiple identities and would supply multiple identities to anybody who wanted them for a fee. And basically, they used credit card bust-out schemes to buy more cigarettes than they knew what to do with. There's very little cost to a cigarette bust-out scheme. Penalties are very small if you get caught. It's actually hard to get caught. Lots of foreign students in North Carolina, lots of great universities, and you just go up to someone and you say, hey, Reuel, you did great in school, Mabruk. Give me your credit cards, give me your checkbook and your social security card. Give me 2 months when you get home, tell them they were stolen. Meanwhile, I've got a perfectly great ID. The student, he's a student, he probably has a good credit rating. I take out a bunch more credit cards, and each of these batches of 9 cards that you have, 18 cards together, is probably about $100,000 in credit right there. And you go crazy. They were buying all kinds of things with this. What they were buying at JCPenney, I can't tell you, but apparently they weren't the best dressed terrorists in town. Now, he was providing some of this not only to the guys here in the United States for cigarette smuggling, but also to Hezbollah networks in Canada, which were procuring dual-use items, laser rangefinders, night vision goggles, that they were sending back to Hezbollah. And this is a surveillance photo taken by our cousins to the north, CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, of 3 Hezbollah guys, and one of them is checking out the false IDs that the other guy is giving to him, and he's handed them over in a box of cigarettes. And he's checking out these IDs. How well did this scam work? Well, let me share with you a snippet from a Canadian surveillance telephone intercept. The Canadians don't hold on to the verbatim after a period of time. They only hold on to the summaries. This is the only case, the Charlotte, North Carolina case in the history of the United States, where so far, where a foreign intelligence service has declassified and provided, in this case, 109 pages of declassified, what we would call FISA, telephone intercepts, for use in open court. This is one of the things I testified to. And this is an amazing thing if you look at paragraph B. A little background. We're going to be speaking here about a guy named Mohammed Dabouk. Mohammed Dabouk used to head the procurement ring in Canada. He has since gone home to Lebanon, and he's communicating from Lebanon with his successors, one of whom is his brother-in-law, in Canada. As background, Dabouk asked 6 different times of his Hezbollah superiors, could he please be allowed to be a suicide bomber? And 6 times they said, no, you're too important. We won't let you be a suicide bomber. Highly trained militant who probably got a stint in Canada as an R&R, as a reward of some sort. Well, if you look in paragraph B, according to the source, which is the Canadians trying to be sneaky and hide the fact that this is a telephone intercept, according to this telephone intercept, in the course of discussing life insurance, Mohammed Dabouk, who's in Lebanon, refers to a person down there, the redaction probably reads South Lebanon, who might in a short period of time go for a, quote, walk, i.e. suicide bombing, and never come back. And wondered if Said, his partner in Canada, could fix some papers and details for him, the person, the suicide bomber, and put himself, Said, in Canada as the reference. Could you take out a Canadian life insurance policy for my suicide bomber with yourself as the beneficiary? Bada bing, bada bang. It's great. It's a win-win, right? Well, Said says, wow, he had not attempted to do such a thing. He'd ask around and see if it could be done, but he warns that such a thing, redaction probably reading, taking out a Canadian insurance policy for a Hezbollah suicide bomber, might not be covered by life insurance. Dabouk says, don't worry, suppose the person was sitting in his village and he's sitting on his front porch and he's sipping iced tea and an Israeli bomb falls on his head. It happens all the time. Don't worry, in other words, I'll get you a death certificate that says something other than suicide bomber. And they didn't do it. Nor did they use any of the $100 counterfeit bills that they were offered. Why? They had more money than they knew what to do with from simple, risk-free credit card bust-out schemes, care of Said Harb. I mentioned that there was once a very, very dangerous Hezbollah guy in this country who was smuggled from Mexico. You're looking at him. Mahmoud Kourani was so dangerous and so known to the intel side of the house that before the FBI was able to put together any real case on terrorism material support, which they ultimately did, they Al Caponed him. They arrested him for, I don't know, remember if it was jaywalking or whatever it was, this first thing they could do, a very small offense, and they went to the judge and said, we know this is crazy, but we're asking you to deny bail. We're putting together other charges. This is a very dangerous man. Not only are we concerned that he will flee back to Lebanon, even though you've seized his passport, Lebanese will go to the Lebanese consulate in Detroit and be handed a brand new passport. They go across into Canada and fly home. Happens all the time. But we are concerned, they said, in open court that he will go and whack people that he thinks are testifying against him. And he is a very, very, I'll let you read about it in the book. It's an amazing, he's basically Hezbollah's 007. Not a very good-looking man, but a very dangerous one. But perhaps the most interesting case here in the United States was a series of incredibly sophisticated FBI penetrations out of Philadelphia, under the category of you can't make this stuff up. It goes like this. Musa Ali Hamdan, who's here in the pictures, he's being arrested in Paraguay, starts off in Brooklyn, and then moves to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. We find out, long story, but we find out, the Joint Terrorism Task Force finds out that he's a low-level Hezbollah guy, fencing stolen items and sending them through Hezbollah's black market networks and keeping some money and sending some back to Hezbollah. His brothers are more senior commanders back home. So we insert a source. The first source is an African-American and doesn't take to Musa, doesn't take to him probably because he's very racist. So we pull out the African-American and we put in someone who's Italian-American and is posing as a street thug for the Italian mob, which ends up opening all kinds of doors. I am convinced, and I'm not kidding, that Hezbollah watches too many episodes of The Sopranos, because this is how it laid out. After a few weeks, Musa Ali Hamdan says to the source, listen, forget about this. Stolen cell phones, stolen PlayStations, a few cars, forget about it. We could do real business. I'm talking $1 million in counterfeit at a time. Would you be willing to go to Lebanon if I get permission, if I vouch for you to my older brother, and you go to Lebanon, you meet with the bosses, if they like you, we could do serious business. We get counterfeit coming out the wazoo. FBI makes all the approvals. He goes to Lebanon, meets with these guys. They say, you know, kid, we like you. We can work with you. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take you around Beirut. It's a beautiful city. You're going to tour around. We'll take pictures of you. We won't be in the pictures. It's not good operational security. But beautiful pictures of you all around Beirut. And when you get home a couple of weeks later, you'll get an album from us with all these pictures of you in Beirut. And just as he's wondering, why the hell would I need you to send me an album? They say, and when you get the album, rip off the front cover of the actual album and secreted inside the cover will be 2 samples of our best counterfeit. I swear you will not be able to tell the difference. You show that to your crime boss, the mafioso, we'll do good business. 2 weeks later, album comes, rips off the cover, 2 brand new crisp bills. Brand new. These did not make it through any handling at all. Hands it to the JTTF, gives it to the Secret Service, comes back and says, I got good news and bad news. It's one and the same. It's not counterfeit. The first assumption is Hezbollah's trying to scam the mob. It's an old scam. You tell someone I got the best counterfeit in the world, so good you won't be able to tell the difference because it's not actually counterfeit. And I charge you, therefore, say 80 cents on the dollar because it's a really good counterfeit. And then when I actually do the deal under a layer of real bills, I give you the crappiest counterfeit that there is, which usually goes for 20, 30 cents, and I just scammed you 50 cents a bill. And then they show it to the Treasury Department, my former home, and they come back and they say, hey, we ran these serial numbers. Sit down. We're about to have your attention. These bills were sent from the United States to Iraq as U.S. government reconstruction money, your taxpayer dollars, my taxpayer dollars, which apparently Hezbollah somehow stole, because they're brand new bills, took to Lebanon, and then sent from Lebanon to the United States, where they're passing them off as counterfeit. Now you got our attention. The source is instructed, go back to your Hezbollah guy, do your best Gambino, get angry, bada bing, bada bang, rough him up a bit, and get all in his face, and he does. And the guy turns white and says, listen, we've already agreed. My boss is coming here to meet your boss. We'll work it all out. And in fact, we had arranged for his boss, not the boss, but the middle-level guy, to come to the United States. The hardest part was getting the State Department to give the visa for the operation, but they did eventually. And we rented a McMansion in Miami because that's what they expected because they watched too many episodes of The Sopranos. And we got an Italian-American FBI undercover to go undercover as the mob boss. Wine him and dine him, take him back to the McMansion, which has been wired every which way to Tuesday. And the Hezbollah guy keeps saying, listen, don't tell anybody. I mean, into the mic, don't tell anybody. And he starts talking about their access to Iranian satellites for better targeting of Israeli cities in the north with the 60,000 rockets they have. He starts talking about the 18 hours a day that the counterfeit machines are running and the kind of bills and the kind of currencies. They prefer $100 bills and 200 euro notes, but they can do whatever you want. And then he says, listen, about that little uncomfortable moment with the counterfeit. We're going to do good business. So I'm going to tell you something we haven't told anybody before. Don't tell anybody again, he says into the mic. February 2008, somebody killed Imad Mughniyeh. How'd they find Imad Mughniyeh? He was nicknamed the Fox, the man who never sleeps. We tried to get them 3 different times at least that we know about publicly and failed. Once thwarted by a very close European ally, but I digress. Who found him? Hezbollah is a very serious intelligence organization. So like any serious intelligence organization, you get a problem, you do a damage assessment, you try and fill the gaps. I don't think they ever figured out who and how, though they strongly suspect the Israelis. But one of their suspicions, and as the former DAS for Intel at Treasury, I'm loving this. One of their suspicions is that we followed the money. What money, you may ask? Excellent question. And he tells the story. We've had an ongoing operational principle going on for years, he explains. Our guys around the world get an opportunity to steal money, they steal the money. Take down a bank, an ATM, a bodega, doesn't make a difference. Swedish krona, US dollar, euro, it's all good. And then you send that money to Iran and it sits in a lockbox, Al Gore style, and just quiet and chills until we feel it's safe. And then that money is sent via Turkey or Syria to Lebanon, to Imad Mughniya. This is Imad Mughniya's terrorist slush fund. And in case we're not clear, he says to us, this is not Hezbollah's political campaign fund. It's not Hezbollah's widow and orphans fund. He says, and I quote, this is Hezbollah, terrorism Hezbollah. So when you're doing ops, you don't mess around with counterfeit. You don't open yourself up to additional law enforcement scrutiny. You do things proper so no one will know. And they fear that we followed that money back to Mughniya. Well, they got to get rid of this money, but you can't just burn it. It's good money. So they're passing it off as counterfeit all over the world. You can't make this stuff up. One other part of this major case, 3 different cases that became major case 251 out of Philadelphia, involved Danny Tariff. Danny Tariff is a dual Lebanese-German citizen who operated an import-export company called Power Express out of Slovakia. FBI determined Power Express was a Hezbollah procurement front in a whole. He gets initiated into this group, and he's trying to procure, as you can see, automatic rifles and manpads, as he describes it, to take down Israeli F-16s. We send a source to tour his facility. We lure him here once, record every keystroke as he's showing us on his laptop exactly, he knows exactly what he wants. And then lure him back a second time to check out the goods and sign the contract. What you're looking at here are stills from the video. The video is never released because you see someone who's cut off at the neck wearing a white shirt on the top picture. That's the undercover FBI agent, so they're not going to make this public. And Danny Tariff, who obviously is out of central casting, bull of a man, no neck, bald head, aviator sunglasses, is testing out the weapons. He signs the contract. He has since been arrested. Musa Ali Hamdan was just convicted to 11 years. Danny Tariff, I'm told, though it's never been made public, and I have yet to confirm, has pled guilty and has yet to ever be sentenced, which is good news, because when someone pleads guilty and there's no sentencing, it means they're cooperating. Let me very quickly just have a comment on what's going on today, so you can understand why there's so much more focus on this today. In February 2008, Imad Mughniya is assassinated, and immediately Nasrallah, that head of Hezbollah, says, Israel, you want open war, as he puts it, we'll give you open war. And very quickly, there's a plot that's thwarted in Baku, Azerbaijan, parenthetically. One of the 2 people who's arrested in Baku, Azerbaijan, is a guy named Ali Karaki. His brother, Hassan Karaki, was also indicted in these FBI cases out of Philadelphia at the same time. Kidnapping plots in West Africa, plots in Egypt and Istanbul, and they fail and fail and fail again. The plot in September 2009 in Turkey, actually, Hezbollah went to Iran and said, look, we're not doing so well. We need your help. Give us more logistical support than usual. And they did, and it still failed. And so you have this strange situation, end of 2009, Iran and Hezbollah are apparently very angry at each other. And it's all put to bed not because they resolved their differences, but because in January 2010, someone sticks a magnetic sticky bomb in the car of Professor Masoud Mohammadi in downtown Tehran on his way to work. Mohammadi turned out to be a very important person in Iran's nuclear program. But more than that, the optics that Iran was not able to protect key personnel at home sent them to the roof. And so this developed in January 2010 a new attack plan on the part of Iran. They called in the Quds Force. You'll establish a new unit, Unit 400, led by 2 people, one of whom used to be targeting Iranian dissidents in Los Angeles. Your job is to target diplomats of Western countries that are trying to undermine our nuclear program. And Hezbollah, you're going to take 6, 7, 8 months off, get your act in gear, recruit the creme de la creme from your militia, and then you're going to target soft targets. You want to still target hard targets, senior Israeli officials to avenge Mughniya, that your business will help you. But for this near quick cost to the Israelis of engaging in a shadow war against our nuclear program, target Israeli tourists around the world. And we see an explosion in attempted plots. Only one succeeds in Burgas, Bulgaria. And meanwhile, other things are happening against the Iranians with these red stars. We, the West, someone is still doing things targeting key officials, and an explosion at a missile base, and Stuxnet and Flame, and all kinds of things are happening and continue to happen around the world, including the three main cases. In the top left, you have Hussein Atras, a dual Lebanese-Swedish citizen, that is to say, a European Hezbollah operative in Thailand, who recently was convicted and sentenced to a few years in jail. Below, on the bottom left, you have what's left of the bus in Burgas, Bulgaria, where 6 individuals were killed and several dozen wounded. And most interestingly, on the right, Hussam Yaqub, another Lebanese Swede, the second in 6 months, another European operative, arrested in Cyprus, since convicted, and is now doing 4 years. Now, what's interesting about this, and you're looking now at part of his deposition by Greek police, this is the official Greek government certified translation of his deposition, which some might call interrogation. In the first instance, he denies everything. And then after a little bit of time, he admits that he's Hezbollah and says, and this is how I was recruited. And then a little while later, he says, look, I am Hezbollah, but that's not at all how I was recruited. This is how I was recruited, and he spills all the beans. And that may surprise, but it shouldn't. We had this, Reuel and I were talking about another case in Iraq, Ali Musa Dagduk al-Musawi, before the event. He too pretended to be, in that case, deaf, dumb, and mute for a period of time. And it's simple. We teach this to some of our undercover operatives, our military as well. Resist interrogation for a little while so that your buddies can leave, and then everybody talks. So give a little bit of truth, buy some time. Ultimately, he admits to the whole thing. And when was he recruited? Was it in 2010 when Iran tasked them with targeting Israeli tourists around the world? No. Was it in 2008 when Mughniyeh was assassinated, and some people say that's what led Hezbollah back into the terrorism business, but when you read the book, you'll see they never got out of it? No. He was recruited a full year earlier. Not all Hezbollah operations are done beautifully. This one, in a very dangerous and scary way, was very beautiful. They sent him to Cyprus many times, and the first bunch of times you're just a tourist. You don't breathe anything else. Meet people, show your face, go back to the same places over and over again. And by the umpteenth time, everybody knows you. And then he said, I've been here so many times, it occurred to me there's a business opportunity. I could be selling Lebanese juices here and be bringing Cypriot trinkets back. And he's got great, great cover. And he uses this cover not only to conduct surveillance of Israeli tourists getting off their chartered airplane and getting on buses, in the instance when he was arrested, but in earlier trips, he was tasked with finding out if there are any kosher restaurants in Cyprus, with carrying out surveillance of specific hotels, and most interesting, asked to carry out really detailed surveillance of a parking lot. Is there an attendant? Do you get a ticket? Do you leave your key? Can you park overnight? Is it sheltered? And it's between a hospital and the traffic police, and nobody can figure out why. And my suspicion, though it's nothing more than that, because this is what happened in Bangkok and in Buenos Aires both, is that Hezbollah has an MO of parking their car bomb in a parking lot within a mile or 2 radius of their intended target. We don't know what they were targeting, but if they were, I bet you it was within a mile or 2 of that location. And at the end of this interrogation, he finally says, as if to explain, look, I know I'm Hezbollah and I was doing the surveillance, but it's not actually terrorism. It was only against the Israelis. He says, and this is almost, if not an exact quote, yes, I'm Hezbollah. I was conducting surveillance of the Jews. This is what my organization does all over the world. And he says Jews, not Israelis, not Zionists, and it's more than a little bit scary. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to you about a very, very dangerous and capable terrorist group. It's an even greater pleasure to be able to do it with Reuel, who actually knows what he's talking about. And so I'll sit down and give him an opportunity, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you all for coming.
My problem is absorbing the information as fast as you're delivering it. You know, for so many of us that we're not deep into this, it really is hard to find. It's a kaleidoscope. And yet, the intelligence agencies are tasked with following us as closely as they can and doing the things that you described. And I'm just going to be brief here and introduce Reuel Marc Gerecht. He's a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Incidentally, I would like to acknowledge our partners in the presentation this evening, which is the Fund for Defense of Democracies. And I think, Toby, you're here, and you are a senior official with, are you here? You are here, yes, thank you, okay. We're very pleased to do this with you. I think it's a very valuable contribution. Marc is the author of The Wave, Man, God, and The Ballot Box in the Middle East, Know Thine Enemy, A Spy's Journey into Revolutionary Iran, and The Islamic Paradox, Shiite Clerics, Sunni Fundamentalists, and the Coming of Arab Democracy. He is a contributing editor for the Weekly Standard, correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly. I see your things in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and that's wonderful that you both not only have the knowledge, but you are trying to make it palatable to the public to help us understand what we are dealing with out there. Marc was previously a resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Middle East Initiative at the Project for the New American Century. He did serve as a Middle Eastern specialist at the CIA's Directorate of Operations. Marc, we're delighted to have you here. It is not his first time.
Books sometimes should always have tapes coming with them, and I can say right away that if Matt would put this book on tape, that I and my 9-year-old son would find it competitive with Lord of the Rings. I was actually enjoying that a lot. You know, it cast my mind back to when I first came into the agency, and at that time, that was back in 1985. The counterterrorism desk, and in fact, it literally was just a desk, was opposite the French desk and the Directorate of Operations. It was really a closet, to tell you the truth. There were no windows, and there was a long desk at which 3 people sat. And it was largely created just a couple of years before to deal with Hezbollah and secondarily to deal with Iran. Though I can add what I always found striking was that on the Iran desk where I served for my entire time there overseas, affiliated with the Iran desk, that there was no Hezbollah officer. In fact, you could spend all your time on the Iran desk and you had some idea that Hezbollah was affiliated with Iran, but there was virtually no operational effort exerted on the Iranian side of the clandestine service to look at Hezbollah. There was a separate Hezbollah office or officer. There was a Lebanese operational center, but the coordination and curiosity did really not cross geography terribly well. Now, I think it's fair to say that we've come a long way since. Now, the thing I would focus on, and again, I'm not going to take much time tonight because Matt's book is really, really rich. And it gives you an idea and a narrative and a calendar that actually is not very hard to absorb. It comes across quite quickly. It's very well written. And it will give you an excellent idea of how active Hezbollah has been, how active the Iranians have been, and how impressive the network is. I think there's always a tendency to diminish these things, and particularly since the rise of al-Qaeda, there has been, I think, a loss of focus on the Hezbollah. And there's also a tendency, because of other activities the Iranians are up to, primarily the nuclear program, I think there is a downgrading sometimes of the nefarious activity of the Iranians, because that would intrude upon the hope that we might somehow be able to negotiate our way out of the nuclear pickle. So we don't want to underscore, I think this administration is guilty of that actually, underscore all the nefarious activities that the Iranians are constantly up to, particularly terrorism. Now, one of the things when I was struck by when I came into the agency, and I was struck by it on the day that I left the agency, which was you almost never had officers, either on the clandestine side or on the Directorate of Analysis, the Directorate of Intelligence, talk about God. You just didn't have that many people sort of put it together and talk about what actually motivated people. There was almost an assumption out there, oh, the Iranians were upset with us because of our dealings with the Shah, et cetera. But the actual analysis of the Iranian complaint against the United States was distinctly secular. Even the analysis of the Hezbollah was distinctly secular. And it never made any sense, particularly if you started to have some exposure to these individuals and you suddenly realize that no, their motivations aren't secular usually. Their motivations are actually deeply spiritual. They are religious. They are about God. And I thought there was actually there's another good book out there on the Hezbollah. It's now my second favorite book on the Hezbollah. It was written by a good friend of mine, Thanos Kanvanis, who I thought did a fine job, and it's quite rare actually to sort of get into the spiritual side of the Hezbollah. But I think it's worthwhile just to read a little bit because I think he captures the essence of the power of the Hezbollah, which I wonder now whether that base of that power is in fact perhaps weakening a bit. But I'll just read just a quick shot here. It says, the Hezbollah indeed had constructed a park over Rani Bazi's gravesite. This was a young man that Thanos became friendly with and has died. A ceramic shingled canopy shaded the two long rows of martyrs' graves flanked by marble benches. Grandiose statues to the martyrs with plaques and stone carvings of their faces gave the whole hilltop the air of a theme park. The revolution had been institutionalized. Hezbollah, I thought, could not be erased. Forever it would be part of the landscape. It would expand and bring on more wars with the momentum and confidence that it acquired during its exponential jump from militant fringe to the Arab world's ideological center. Somehow, Hezbollah had pulled off an artful feat. It had preserved its dynamism and radical pedigree while making itself into an establishment. Hezbollah's followers trusted the party, even adored it. That love gave Hezbollah its unique power. It enabled the party to strike a pose of eternal confrontation, knowing that any war it sparked would only strengthen Hezbollah's hands with its followers. And I think the most important word in that description actually is love. And I think that is something that the Hezbollah had, maybe still has, a very firm grip on, and that is that the Lebanese Shia community, a big slice of the Lebanese Shia community in Lebanon, has loved the organization, has defined its identity through the organization, that has defined its religious belief through the organization. It's quite a feat. I mean, if you look and do an Iranian parallel, I would argue that the Iranian death wish believer, the fanatical followers of Khomeini, really died off in the battlefields of Mesopotamia. They were more or less extinguished by the time the Iran-Iraq war was over and Khomeini died in 1989. You still had fanatical believers, but the slice of them out of the total population, I would argue, had become quite small to what it had been at one time, where quite literally tens of thousands of young men, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of young men, sought their deaths, and they eagerly sought their deaths upon the battlefields against Saddam Hussein's forces. War had burned it out of them. War often burns out fanatical religious belief. Iran, actually my favorite holy warriors in Iran of all time, they're my favorite holy warriors, period. The Qizilbash, of the Safavids, the Redheads. I mean, they had their Ottoman cannons really took a lot out of them. But the quality of that belief has sustained itself in Lebanon, and as he said, it has sustained itself as Hezbollah has actually become established. And it's not just the downtrodden, the poor, that have become faithful to Hezbollah. It is, in fact, the middle class, even parts of the upper class, have become faithful to Hezbollah. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? And then you have to ask yourself, all right, if you've got some answer for why that's the case, can that change? And I think that's the interesting question. I mean, for example, is the conflict in Syria, is that changing the attachments, the identities, the loyalties in the Lebanese Shia community to the Hezbollah? Is, for example, the Hezbollah's blatant attachment and support of the Alawi community in what is becoming a very defined sectarian struggle and battle, is that diminishing Hezbollah's power within the Shia community and actually within Lebanon? We know for sure that it has caused great turbulence in the Sunni world, and that Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, is certainly no longer the most popular man in the Middle East, which at one time, not that long ago, he could have laid claim to. But the interesting question, the deadly question, is the Syrian conflict somehow affecting the ties and the bonds that exist between the Lebanese Shia community and Hezbollah? Are people beginning to break away from the institution because of the barbarism that the Hezbollah is engaged in Syria, because of the general revulsion that is felt elsewhere in the Arab world? Granted, it's the Sunni Arab world. And does the sectarian, as the sectarian identity solidifies in this battle, will it affect at all the loyalty of the Lebanese Shia community to the Hezbollah? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that the answer to that is maybe. That the Hezbollah may have actually bitten off more than it can chew, and that the mystique of the Hezbollah, particularly the mystique of the Hezbollah as being at the front of the resistance to Israel, and secondarily to the West, is, I think, perhaps taking a severe hit. I mean, only time will tell. We'll have to watch other Shiite groups inside of Lebanon. You'd have to look at Amal, for example, which pre-exists the Hezbollah, whose foundation had nothing to do with the resistance against Israel. In fact, its foundation had more to do with resistance against the Palestinians, who are, of course, pillaging the Shia communities under Yasser Arafat. But all that seems like ancient history now. So, I mean, that's where I would pay attention. And again, I would add here, because there is a profound reflex in the West to look at a group like Hezbollah and to look at their Iranian sponsors and to take God out of the equation. Don't do that. Wouldn't do it with Al-Qaeda. Don't do it with these groups either. If you do that, if you neuter them of their religious belief, if you look at it as just an ethnic movement, if you look at it as just a sectarian movement, if you look at it as just the Shia getting even in Lebanon, then you're making an atrocious analytical mistake, which will bushwhack you, I guarantee you, over and over again. You have to keep God into this equation. And if you do, then I think you can begin to understand, and you can begin to see why in Matt's book you have what I would regard as just this incredible tenacity. They keep going at it. They do operation after operation after operation. And they keep coming for us, they keep coming for global Jewry, and they keep coming for Israel. And the reason for that is not because of Shiite anger at its minority position in Lebanon. They do it because their worldview, which is a religious worldview, sees a huge struggle, a clash of civilizations, a divine clash, where they are on the front line, and they give a sense of purpose and identity to enough young men to make them quite deadly. So on that happy note, I'll stop.
Yeah, I'm always impressed when people come out of government and reflect that kind of expertise on events that we're trying to follow, on the adversaries we are trying to follow. And what I'd like to do with our remaining time is open it to you all for questions. And if I may ask a couple of questions first. There was a piece in, and I think it was the Post, that a subset of applicants to the intelligence community, job applicants to the intelligence community, 20% of them were considered to have relations or ties with Middle Eastern countries that we were concerned about, or Middle Eastern organizations. Are you familiar with that? Can you comment on that?
On the one hand, one of the things that makes us so capable as a country is that we're a melting pot. And that gives us a tremendous resource for our intelligence community. You want to tap into those people who understand foreign cultures and speak foreign languages, on the one hand. On the other hand, it presents a counterintelligence quandary. And so there's a process of trying to vet. And I think that it's critically important to get patriotic Americans of every ethnicity involved. NYPD on a much, much smaller scale, with New York being such a tremendous melting pot, has its own intelligence unit. And what it has done immensely well is just this. It has gone into the academy, and before people even get there, it spots people of Pakistani descent and Yemeni descent and what have you, and offers them an opportunity to do something a little different undercover. And that has enabled them to do some pretty amazing things.
All right. Reuel, I wanted to ask you, your description of the religious basis of so much of Hezbollah's actions is very persuasive. Is the sharper clash between Hezbollah, the Shia community, and the West, or is it between the Shia community and the Sunnis?
Well, do I need this? There's no doubt that the initial clash, the defining clash, certainly in the 1980s for Hezbollah, is with Israel. However, the clash inside of Lebanon is always there. So the Hezbollah is feeding on the grievances that really allowed Amal to grow, that brought forth the great character Musa Sadra, who Fuad Ajami wrote a brilliant book, one of the greatest books written on the Middle East, called The Vanished Imam. I mean, it is a combination, a confluence of these complaints that allowed Hezbollah to develop, but Hezbollah defines itself in opposition to Israel, and in a larger sense, and you must never remove that larger sense, in an opposition to the West. And global Jewry is always there, because global Jewry is seen as a pillar, a guiding force, and a Machiavellian agent of Western leadership.
Okay. Thank you both. Why don't we go ahead and take your questions? I would just ask you to wait for the microphone so everybody can hear the question. And okay, here's my hand right here. Amanda, right here.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Greg Dyer, I work at the Pentagon. Just a question. We understand, you understand more than we. Hezbollah is a political party, not a hafla. It's not a birthday party. This is not hafla Allah. This is not a birthday party or a celebration for Allah. They have taken that and permeated several different dimensions to include social, all those things. They've been able to infiltrate different structures. I wonder if you could speak to that in addition to what you've already done, and maybe compare and contrast your thoughts on the Sinn Féin arm of the IRA and potential mitigating ways of addressing the awful things that are taking place. Thank you very much.
So it's a great question and an accurate analysis. They are Hezbollah, the party of God, and they have been as effective as they are for two reasons. One, they have molded the overt and the covert. They have molded the militant and the social welfare. They have provided a voice politically and food and shelter and education to a segment of the community that was always disregarded. And that's been very effective at home. But the other reason they're anything more than a mildly annoying, really radical bunch of nut jobs is because of Iran. Were it not for Iran's training, intel support, finance, we believe around, changes over time, but around $200 million a year, and arming of rockets in particular, they're the 8th largest arsenal of rockets in the world. The other 7 are all actual sovereign countries. They'd be just another thing. And this is where I can't agree with Reuel more. They're not just another political party in that regard. They're entirely different from Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin never sought to destroy the United Kingdom. It never sought to destroy another country. It never sought to take over all of the United Kingdom. And though they are religious, they are not religious at all in comparison to a group like Hezbollah, who see themselves on a divine mission. And I have a quote in the book where I quote a senior Hezbollah official who says, and it's scary but refreshing, he says, "If you don't appreciate our sincere commitment to the principle of walayat al-faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, that the supreme leader says and it must be done, then you don't understand us." Can you say that for every foot soldier? Probably not. But for the senior leaders of Hezbollah, absolutely. So why would Hezbollah put its political standing internationally or at home at risk by assassinating Israelis all over the world that has nothing to do with its issues immediately or in Lebanon? Why would it do what it's doing in Syria? Because Iran has asked it to, and they're in a strategic partnership together. I'll just add to what Reuel said before. There's no question, Israel is their enemy number one, and the West is part of that, and part of Israel is their enemy number one because it's the Western imprint in the Holy Land. But remember, long before Hezbollah targeted any single Israeli, for that matter, a single Jew, it was blowing up Americans, it was blowing up Kuwaitis, it was doing things in all kinds of corners of the world that had nothing to do with Israel. This developed over time, again, at Iran's behest, because Hezbollah became Iran's long arm into the Mediterranean, and this became a very, very effective tool for it.
Sorry, thank you. Follow-up, sir. So with that in mind, though, since we know since 2008, Iranian support for killing of American soldiers, including supplying EFPs, explosive foreign projectiles, through known areas, what are your thoughts on the practical and pragmatic ways and the political constraints on how the U.S. can conform to, handle that?
Well, you should feel free to jump in. We were talking about this right beforehand about this exact case. One of the themes you'll see throughout the book, Beirut bombings, Khobar Towers, Saudi Arabia, killing Air Force personnel as they slept in their beds, Hezbollah's dedicated Unit 3800 created to support Iraqi Shia militants and do things on their own, an entire chapter on that in the book. Throughout Hezbollah and Iran's history, there has never, not once, been a serious consequence for these behaviors. And that has left them, and it's in the CIAD class that I include in the book, with a very clear impression that terrorism is not only financially inexpensive, it's not only effective, Marines left Beirut, but it's also cost-free in any political sense. So the big to-do that we did after Khobar is we sent a guy who wasn't very well publicly known then, but you now may know the name John Brennan, who was CIA station chief in Riyadh at the time, to literally go knock on the windows of the cars of the Iranian agents that were following him. And this was considered, a real slap in the face to the Iranians after they killed 19 of our servicemen.
I just got to underscore that they really did think that was serious. And it's just, I have to say, it's just mind-boggling. If you look at it from the Iranian perspective, they are literally killing American soldiers, and we do nothing. And they know, we know that they're responsible, and we do nothing.
Well, we had those guys in jail.
Yeah, it's just, George Shultz gave a speech after the Beirut bombings, which I think is the definitive and best speech ever given by a U.S. official on terrorism, where he just said, you've got to treat this seriously. You've got to treat it as an act of war, and you have to kill people in response. Needless to say, the response in the New York Times to Schultz's speech was that, oh my God, we can't do this. This is extreme.
And for the record, the French, who were also targeted that day, they did respond. Not very well. They sent a few airplanes and fired a few missiles, and either they missed by far on purpose or they just weren't very good. But they did something.
Well, we were supposed to respond with them, and Weinberger actually disobeyed a presidential order.
Over there, all up near you, Laura. Yeah, right there.
How's it going? Tom Stein, I'm with the U.S. Army. I just had a question. If we were to strategically degrade Hezbollah's terrorist activities, would the center of gravity for that be Iranian transference of weapons, equipment, and training, or would it be their social network that they've developed in Lebanon? The two branching off into various and more difficult target sets.
Fantastic question. Ideally, you do both. And ideally, by targeting their social networks, you'd undermine their ability to create what they call, in their words, a culture of resistance in Lebanon, which is they intend to go well beyond the Shia. Keep in mind, after they dragged Israel into a war in 2006 by crossing into sovereign Israel and kidnapping Israeli soldiers, which Hezbollah's leader Nasrallah later said, mea culpa, if I knew the Israelis would have been so angry about it and invaded, I wouldn't have done that. And then again, less than 2 years later in 2008, when they took over downtown Beirut by force of arms, they have used Iranian largesse to build this culture of resistance. But we don't have a good track record of doing that type of thing. USAID has a hard time operating in Lebanon. In an easier place, a much easier place in the West Bank after Hamas and Fatah split, we said, fine, we'll show that you can work with the good Palestinians and Fatah on the West Bank and that there's a difference, and the Hamas and the Gaza will suffer, and they'll see that there's potential to do things the right way, and we failed. You can try, and we do try, to degrade them with financial tools and other ways to make it difficult for them to pay and move weapons. But as I said, ultimately, the center of gravity is going to be Iran. I'm not saying that regime change is an easy thing, or I'm not calling for war with Iran tomorrow, but I am saying that if you want to be able to make Hezbollah the local, annoying, radical group that it really should be, without global reach, without 60,000 rockets that can change a region, without the capability to do what we've seen it do in Qusair in Syria, then you're talking about Iran. Now, one other thing that was said earlier, I think Reuel had said it, was getting to the issue of Hezbollah standing in Lebanon now, which gets to your question as well. I fear that Hezbollah has already calculated that the sectarian conflict has gotten so bad, they've written off the Sunnis, the Maronites. They haven't written off the Druze, because the Druze will follow whoever is in the greatest position of strength, because that's how they get by in every country they live in. In Israel, they're loyal to the Israeli state, Syria to Syria, etc. They've written off the Sunnis and the Christians. And I think they've figured out a way to win back the many, many Shia that are very angry at Hezbollah. It's a very simple solution. Double down and double down again. Because the more you make this conflict, which was a rebellion and became a civil war and is now a sectarian conflict that respects no boundaries and is spilling over towards Iraq and Lebanon both, the more it becomes a sectarian conflict. The more the Shia of Lebanon, including those who are angry at Hezbollah, by default will have to circle the wagon for fear that if Hezbollah doesn't win, these crazy al-Qaeda, Takfiri, Salafi, jihadi lunatics will massacre us, which is the message Hezbollah and Iran are both purveying. And I think it's probably going to, if it hasn't already, gain traction, which means this is going to be something that's going to be a protracted and difficult conflict. I'm beginning to be as optimistic as you.
Okay. There was one up here, I thought. Yes, right there.
What are your thoughts on designations as a public targeting mechanism and the gap between Treasury and State, how one agency may target them, another one may not?
Wow, no, that's a wonky.
Well, as the former DAS for Treasury, that's my wonk, How long you got, buddy? That's sexy stuff. So the difference between Treasury and State is actually on the terrorism designations is fairly simple. With rare exception, State designates the trigger pullers and Treasury designates the facilitators and financiers under the 13224 Terrorism Executive Order. Treasury has some other lists and State has other lists, but generally as a rule, look, I'm a big fan. For 2 years, all Treasury designations went out under 2 signatures. One of them was mine. But my concern, and I used to actually push back at the White House a lot, my concern is that people tend to think on situations where you don't have good answers to difficult problems, oh, Treasury can designate. And that, I felt, undermined our authorities, because you want to designate when it's the right thing to do, not because there's nothing else to do. So sometimes it's not the right thing to do. There are many more targets that fit threshold for designation and aren't designated, because maybe you're going to send a director of operations to do something, or there'll be a penetration or law enforcement or an arrest or what have you. Or diplomacy, which, by the way, is not necessarily a 4-letter word. So it can be a very, very effective tool. We've done actually amazing things on Hezbollah with designations and other financial tools. We have hurt them hard. Hezbollah and Iran are in a strategic partnership, yes, and I don't think Hezbollah loses a moment's sleep that Iran might throw them under the bus under some grand bargain, but Hezbollah has moved much more into international organized crime, including not producing, but transferring and laundering the proceeds of drugs. Why? Because they're diversifying their financial portfolio. Why? Because at least twice in the open source, we know that Iran has suddenly, with no advance notice, cut Hezbollah's budget, in one instance, by as much as 30 to 40%. I mean, if you're Hezbollah, you'd rather be told, boys, no more rockets this month. You're going to have to do with the 60,000 you have. But you start cutting into their budget. Here in Washington, we call that sequestration. That's layoffs. You can't build a culture of resistance by saying, your shelter is more important than your hot food program, and I'm going to lay you off, and I'm so sorry. It doesn't work that way. This is catastrophe. And so the financial tools can be extremely effective, and not only on Hezbollah, but on Iran as well. But if you think that they will solve your problem, no financial tool by itself is going to solve any problem.
Okay, one right here. Hold on.
Alan Pizer, Investigative Project.
Okay, then you're next.
So you talk about Hezbollah and their operations around the world, and there are many places you haven't mentioned all over South America, and on and on and on. And so their money comes from Iran, most of it. They're funded through Iran. And we've talked about sanctions, but sanctions in the context of nuclear weapons. But sanctions also are important to limit their money for this reason, for influencing Hezbollah and many other organizations. Would you talk about that?
I thought I just did. I'm not talking about the nuclear proliferation sanctions right now. Many of the sanctions, 13224 as a terrorism designation, is strictly about terrorism, has nothing to do with proliferation. Now, when we've targeted Iranian banks, for example, the vast majority of it targeted under proliferation executive orders, but don't think that that means that this bank is entirely and very neatly in a pretty little box that only does proliferation. Maybe we designated them under proliferation regime because that was the easiest one to do, but definitely it affected the finance of terrorism as well. There's only one bank, Iranian bank, where we did it specifically under terrorism threshold, and that was Bank Saderat. And I think one of the reasons so many banks were done under proliferation EOs is because that got more traction with our European allies. But ultimately, I don't care what title you do it under, the effect is the same. And all of the Hezbollah-specific sanctions, all of them are terrorism. You're right, there are lots of things we didn't talk about up here in 25-minute presentations. Read the book, and it'll blow your mind.
I would just add one thing. I mean, to run the CIA's clandestine service is really cheap, right? And it is by far and away the largest foreign intelligence service in the world. And there are several American billionaires who could run it all by themselves. It just really doesn't cost that much money. So when you start talking about using money as a tool against terrorists, I'm always in favor of it, but you have to be realistic. It really just doesn't cost a lot of money to do certain types of operations which will kill you.
I might mention, by the way, that there was an excellent review of Matt's book in the Wall Street Journal of 9 October, The Tip of the Mullah Spear. Just a superb review. So, and the book has just come out. It's just come out this month, right?
Came out last month, and in an email with some of you here at the Spy Museum with Reuel, he actually asked me if my mother wrote that review because it was so good. And she could have, but she didn't, for the record.
She did a good job. Okay. All right, let's see. Right there, the lady there. Yes.
Katerina Živanović from the Serbian Embassy. I was wondering about their role in the Balkans. So I know that they were very involved in the Bosnian War. So do you know if there are any presence, or are they doing anything there now? Thank you.
It's a great question. I thought I'd find a lot more about Hezbollah in the Balkans, and I didn't. Iran played a very pronounced role in the Balkans. Hezbollah was there, and I dug up a clip of Nasrallah bragging about this, and that there was a Hezbollah guy, and he was martyred, but it was very small numbers. By the way, where did we find this clip? In the home of the Charlotte Hezbollah guys who were using it in their Thursday night meetings as fundraising pitches to raise money for Hezbollah. But there are Hezbollah snippets in the book in some of the former Soviet Union states, a lot of activities with organized crime. When we had the attack in Burgas, Bulgaria, I don't know why people were as surprised as they were. U.S. and other intelligence agencies had identified Bulgaria as a place that both Iran and Hezbollah had pointed out as a weak spot where they could operate, and then the periphery of Europe. They'd been working with drug smugglers for some time, moving drugs through Bulgaria, and there are other places in the region as well. In the case I mentioned with Slovakia, we actually had great cooperation from their government on this operation. This wasn't a case where they were in any way complicit with the fact that there was a Hezbollah procurement front going on there. This can happen anywhere. We have things like this happening in the United States, and they were very good partners.
Right here, Amanda.
You mentioned working with the EU partners and how it was sometimes easier to do it under non-proliferation than terrorism. I wonder if you could comment on the difficulty that EU states have had in designating Hezbollah, trying to just designate the military wing, or what is the basis of that difficulty for the Europeans?
So I submitted the book in December and had 9 months to twiddle my thumbs until it came out. That happened to coincide exactly with the whole debate about the European Union designation. So I did about 7 or 8 trips back and forth. I testified before the European Parliament on this. Ministries of Interior and Foreign Ministries, and there are FBIs and CIAs and the EU ad nauseum. It's an amazing thing because the people who are most articulate about the fact that there is no such thing as a distinct wing within Hezbollah of anything. Hezbollah was established as an umbrella organization to bring in all these different Shia militant groups in 1982-83, but very quickly became very structured and hierarchical. And it's very clear that the terrorist wing and the security services report to the Jihad Council, which reports to the Shura Council, which is headed by Nasrallah himself. The people who are most articulate about this are Hezbollah. They're very, very annoyed when people don't appreciate this. Naim Qassem, the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah, says, and it's like he's speaking to 2-year-olds, there is no distinction. He says it time and time again. So the Europeans engage in a political contrivance. And if you get them privately over beer, which I have, they'll admit that. By the way, we do that in this country too. Go take a look at the voting districts in the United States, with a finger going this way and then going. It's a political contrivance also, so that somebody can have a more pure Democratic or Republican district that he or she may actually be able to win again. We all engage in political contrivances. Some European countries were uncomfortable with the idea of designating in whole or in part any entity that is in fact a political party that is in fact duly elected in Lebanon. They were uncomfortable with the idea that this might mean that they couldn't engage with Hezbollah, which is a primary political party in Lebanon, and that might minimize their ability to help assure Lebanon's stability and indeed regional stability. Now, parenthetically, the Common Position 931, which is the European Union's designation authority, it is strictly and only an asset forfeiture tool, not to get too wonkish again. There actually is no ban on contact. There's no ban on movement. And I'd meet with European Union officials who work this issue, and they would say to me, Matt, if we do this, we'll be banned from contact. No, you won't, and I have to show them. There were also some who were worried that there would be retaliation, either in Europe or against UNIFIL forces in the south of Lebanon, and a whole host of other things. At the end of the day, Hezbollah had carried out the bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria, tried to do the same in Cyprus, had been recruiting as European operatives, was counterfeiting European currency. For some European countries like Germany, that was really important. For others like France, what turned them around at the end of the day and led to them leading the charge on this was Syria. Had nothing to do with Europe. And under CP 931, the activities don't need to have anything to do with Europe. But it was very, very interesting. And the last thing I'll say, because I know you want to say something, is this. Many people say this is useless, it's meaningless, it's a farce. And in some ways it is, because there is no distinction between the wings. But what I told lots of groups who were making a fuss about this before they actually did the designation was, shut up. Pocket this. Because this can be good, and it's certainly better than nothing. And then convinced to push for more. But for example, some of the smaller European countries I met with said, look, we can't, under our definition of our legal domain, we can't open up investigations, intelligence investigations into Hezbollah because they're not a designated entity in the EU. And we are a small little country. We don't have terrorism lists of our own, so we just use the EU. Well, now they have that. Now, there's no automaticity. So what the Americans are doing and the Israelis are doing and some others is creating a cause and effect. That is to say, they're sharing information. They may not have decided to act on this authority on their own, but now they're being provided information about Hezbollah activities in their countries. They can't afford to ignore that, lest, God forbid, something happens tomorrow and it turns out they were sitting on information. So there are ways we can make this useful, and we can push for more.
I would just add to that, I am very fond of the French for many reasons that extend beyond wine and Calvados and Plateau de Fruits de Mer and all those wonderful things that, they've had, in my experience, probably the best folks on terrorism, both within Europe and overseas. I am happiest when I am with them discussing many aspects of Iran and Iranian terrorism. But the way in which the French, up until recently, had avoided the issue of Hezbollah is quite something. And I could never really get an adequate explanation for it, other than certain cultural peculiarities of the French experience there, of the fact that there are tens of thousands of French citizens who live in Lebanon. That matters, by the way. That seriously matters for the French. It affects all of their calculations. And then just the one that is universal throughout Europe. There's something about a terrorist organization that has welfare practices that sort of just appeals to the left-wing heart of the Europeans and makes them somewhat difficult to look at the whole picture, because they're looking at the social welfare.
I'll just add, bottom line, 1985, 1986, 15 bombings terrified the French, scarred them for a very, very long time, and they wanted nothing of it. And by some accounts, and I sort of allude to this a little bit in the book, they maybe struck a deal. Nothing here, nothing there.
That too.
Okay, I think we can take one more right there.
So you mentioned the number of umbrella organizations that came together to form Hezbollah, and I know that for Lebanese supporters of Hezbollah, it's very important to make this distinction between the Hezbollah era and the era before, and they say, oh, that particular attack was before Hezbollah. That wasn't Hezbollah. Those people were crazy and they got weeded out eventually. And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit about when Hezbollah became Hezbollah and whether there's any importance at all to that distinction, or whether all of those Shia militant groups were always essentially the same as Hezbollah and it's just a name change.
It's an excellent question, and I will admit to you that in some ways the hardest part of the book to write were the early chapters, and wrapping my head around this and trying to get it right. First of all, we know through individuals. The key individuals were the same: Mugnia, Badruddin, even other people. The CIA, I found CID class talking about Hassan Nasrallah being personally involved in kidnappings and other acts of terrorism before he became Secretary General and is now seen as a political person. I mentioned the intercept we have from the Iranians about the Marine barracks bombing. And there is this kind of gray period when they are merging under this umbrella, and they were still maintaining on to their original names. You know, Islamic Amal had split from Amal and wasn't yet Hezbollah as such. But the bottom line is they were carrying out operations even then under multiple names. And one of the things I track, and I keep talking about American D-class, but there's stuff here from countries around the world, including countries you'd never think of, Romania and Chile and Singapore, the cover names that they used over this period of time. There's debate as to when exactly Hezbollah was founded. 1982, 1983 was when their official charter the letter was published in 1985. They were already carrying out operations, kidnappings and hijackings and things in particular under all kinds of names that were absolutely identified. In some cases, they use them specifically that way as Hezbollah. So it's an out. By the time they were doing the Beirut bombings, and I put the several bombings, 18 months of bombings, twice in the embassy, Beirut bombing, the barracks bombing, this was Hezbollah. There's absolutely no question about that. And those who say otherwise at home either are being insincere or, far more likely, in Lebanon, just don't believe it. Most Lebanese don't believe anything you'll read in this book because Hezbollah is the element that defends and protects the Shia community in Lebanon, and it is the element that provides them social welfare and benefits. And if you try and analyze Hezbollah as just an Iranian proxy or just a terrorist organization, you miss that, you misunderstand Hezbollah. I stated at the outset of the book, I didn't do research for this in Lebanon. This is not about Lebanon. It's not about Hezbollah. It's not about Hezbollah in Lebanon, not because Hezbollah isn't all these things there. It is, and there's lots of literature out there on it. And Thanasis' book is one of the best. Nick Blanford's is another. But you can find that literature. This was the gap.
Last comment, Reuel?
No, I mean, you know, evolution happens. And evolution can be quite quick or it can be quite slow. I think in Hezbollah's case, it was quite quick. You know, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps wasn't born overnight. It took a while for its component parts, a bit of time, for those components parts to come together, for an identity to be built on the battlefield. I think the same is true for the Hezbollah.
And by the way, Naim Qassem, the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah, actually makes this point himself very, very clearly in his own book on Hezbollah and about the 1,500 Pastor and Quds force that came and the training that everyone was required to go to under them in the Ballot, even in those early years.
Matt Levitt, Reuel Gerecht, thank you so much for a really terrific evening and presentation today. Again, thank you to the Fund for Defending Democracy for partnering with us, and thank you all for coming. Have a great evening.